Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Victober video. Today I'm going to be continuing on with my 5 Victorian novels about series, and I have 5 Victorian novels for you today about work. So the role of work in Victorian literature is one that really interests me, both in terms of the actual jobs that Victorian characters do in novels, and also in terms of work as a theme and kind of work as a driving force in some ways, and especially the ways in which work ties into gender, both in terms of what work is considered suitable for women to do, both in and out of the home, and also in terms of the emphasis placed on a man having a profession, this kind of sort of middle-class, respectable masculinity that is really important in the Victorian period. This video was sort of requested by Libby Stevenson, who said she would like to see a video about 5 Victorian novels about work/jobs. I feel like mine is more about the theme of work than about like books that deal very technically with jobs. However, there's a bit of both. So I have 5 books to tell you about. I'm going to start off with North and South. This is a really, really interesting novel, and one that I love in many, many ways. It looks at a young lady who is uprooted by her father from their country parsonage where they live to the northern industrial town of Milton. This book looks at work in a really interesting way, both in terms of Margaret's father, who has been a clergyman and having doubts about the Anglican Church becomes a kind of dissenter and a teacher, and his efforts to kind of try and find work for himself in this new place are really, really interesting. The book is also fascinating in terms of looking at the running and working of a mill from 2 perspectives. One of the most important characters in this book, John Thornton, is a mill owner, but some of the other important characters in this book, such as Nicholas Higgins, work in a factory. So you get to see like both sides and look interestingly at the kind of jobs and working environment of both of those 2 men and the divisions between them. The book also looks really interestingly at trade unions and strikes. It looks really, really interesting at kind of the working environment and living environment around the people who work in cotton mills, and it's really, really fascinating. It's also quite interesting to look at Margaret and her relationship with work. Margaret is really interested in the kind of workers around her and in finding out more about factory life. Meanwhile, at home, she ends up doing a lot more work than she used to previously. Previously, they had several servants in the parsonage, but now they only have 1 servant, and Margaret ends up doing quite a large proportion of the housework as well, which really disturbs her mother, who's like really upset by the idea that Margaret, her like lady daughter, is doing all this housework. So that's another really interesting way in that work plays into this novel. It's a really, really great book, and one I would definitely recommend, especially if you're interested in work as a theme in Victorian literature. The next Victorian novel about work I want to recommend is Bleak House. This is one of my favourite Dickens novels, and one that I'm currently hosting a read-along of. Bleak House is a really interesting novel for many ways. One of the things I really like about it is the way that it looks at work and different jobs. This book is kind of focused around the legal profession, which is quite heavily critiqued in here. And basically the kind of core, the centre of the book is this case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. This has been going on for generations and generations, this disputed will that no one can work out, and therefore no one gets money from it, but the kind of case just carries on and ruins all the lives of all the people who are caught up in it. Anyway, this book looks quite interestingly at the legal profession and kind of the workings of the Chancery Court in the 19th century. But aside from that, Bleak House also does really interesting things in terms of work and gender, especially if you look at 2 main characters in it, Richard and Esther. Richard Carston is a young man who is a ward in Chancery, so he has the chance, a very small chance, of inheriting lots of money from this case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. But there's no knowing when that will happen, so he needs to find a profession, he needs to have something to do with his life, but he's not very good at settling down to do this because he keeps on thinking that, well, it's just possible he might get this money from the case. And the way that Dickens examines like Richard's relationship with work, and especially the way it looks at that in terms of like masculinity, I think is really, really interesting, because Richard's failure to be able to stick to a profession is basically presented as a kind of failing of masculinity within the Victorian system. It's really, really, really interesting. Another really interesting thing in Bleak House is the character of Esther. Now, Esther is kind of a companion to Ada and Richard, these wards in Chancery who live with a man called Mr. Jarndyce. It's a very complicated plot, I can't explain it all here. Esther, anyway, has an unusual position in a household where she is sort of a companion, sort of a housekeeper. Now, Esther is an illegitimate child, her parents were not married, she knows very little about them, but she's been taught from her youngest childhood days to be self-denying, that she isn't worth that much, and Esther's kind of driving force through a lot of the book is the desire to be useful and to work, to do as much work as possible, and to be as useful to those around her as possible. So she kind of takes on this role of being a housekeeper, and she looks after the keys, she kind of tries to look after everyone and do as much as possible. She always wants to be busy, and she often says to herself like work, 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 duty, 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 and things like that. And her attitude towards housework and like her deep drive to be useful are really, really, really interesting. There's also a lot of really interesting things about in Bleak House about like work and charity and people who work for charities but don't necessarily do it out of desire to help people, but just to make themselves feel better. But there's a lot in this book and there's too much for me to go into here. It's a really, really interesting book. If you're interested in work in Victorian literature, I would definitely pick this one up. Next, I want to mention Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Now, Thomas Hardy in general is a really great author to read if you're interested in reading about work, because he writes quite a lot about rural communities and about farming and about the ins and outs of farming, and also sometimes about other kind of crafty roles. Jude in Jude the Obscure is a stonemason, which I also find really interesting. And Far from the Madding Crowd goes into a lot of detail about farming and shepherdry. While it is in many ways a book about a young woman who inherits a farm from her uncle and is courted by 3 suitors, it's also very much a book about sheep. But a really, really good one, and one that I would highly recommend. It's also a really, really interesting book in terms of the way that it looks at the position of women doing work that is considered men's work. Bathsheba Everdeen, the main character in this book, inherits a farm from her uncle, and she decides that she is going to run it herself, which is very rare. People are quite confused by the fact that a woman is running a farm. She has quite a bit of trouble at the beginning kind of showing her authority and proving to herself and to the world that she can do this, and that is really, really fascinating. Brilliant, brilliant Hardy book, one I would highly recommend. The next book I want to recommend is The Half Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury. This is one of my favourite Victorian novels, a really, really interesting, very, very underrated, criminally underrated read. It's so absolutely fantastic, and it follows 2 sisters who share the same father, different mothers, completely different backgrounds, don't know each other for most of their lives. They grow up completely independently. One is middle class and one is working class. And one of the things I find really interesting in this book is that our more working class character, Bianca, becomes an actress. And she loves acting. And the way this book writes about acting and like how she enjoys being on the stage and how much she enjoys like working for a living and working for something she loves is just wonderful. It's really, really enjoyable and really, really great. And one of the things this book looks at quite interestingly is kind of the difference between Bianca and Alice, the more middle-class sister. Bianca becomes an actress, which in the Victorian period is pretty much as low down the social spectrum as you can go. It's considered like basically akin to prostitution. And Alice becomes a respectable middle-class housewife. She waits at home for her husband and is bored. She's so thoroughly and utterly bored because she doesn't have anything to do and she doesn't have a purpose to her life. And basically the book kind of looks at how Alice is the Victorian ideal, but actually she is unhappy and perhaps not so angelic as she might seem, and how Bianca, who is considered far more unrespectable than her sister, is actually like much happier and more fulfilled because she works and she really, really loves her acting. And there are parts in this book where Bianca talks about being an actress and how much she likes it and how much she would never give it up and how much she adores acting, and it's just lovely. It's just really, really good. I would super, super recommend this book. It's absolutely fantastic and definitely worth a read, and especially if you're interested in work and sort of gender and work in Victorian literature. Finally, I want to recommend The Odd Women by George Gissing. This is another one about gender and work and about the different choices women might make in terms of work. The Odd Women, which I feel like I recommend a lot on this channel, but it's because it's amazing. The Odd Women looks at single women in the Victorian period and kind of what they do with their lives and their efforts to make a living and make perhaps a career for themselves. And the book looks at the way these women kind of make lives for themselves in the absence of a husband and children, which is what Victorian women are brought up to expect to have, and that is what is considered the kind of role of women within Victorian society. So if you're not playing that role, what role do you play? And it's such an amazing and very feminist book, and I love it a lot. And it examines quite a lot of different kinds of work. One thing I find really interesting is how it looks at how sort of the possibilities of women's work have changed quite a lot over the 19th century. Now with the introduction of the typewriter, there's more secretarial work. It looks at teaching and caring for children. It also looks at shop work. In fact, some of the early scenes in this book about one of the characters in it who works in a shop and just like the awful, appalling hours she works and how utterly miserable and how draining this work is. It's examined so interestingly and so well. Like, I would really, really recommend this book. I think it's really, really interesting in terms of looking both at like physical work and how hard it can be, but also about kind of the role of work within gender identity for women in the 19th century and the increasing role of work outside the home in women's lives. It's a really, really brilliant read and one that I would definitely recommend. There we have it. Those are 5 Victorian novels about work. Please let me know down in the comments if you have any other Victorian novels you would like to recommend that deal with the theme of work, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.